Feeling good. Makes you want to jump out of bed. Marvin is an extremely accomplished name and character right across the spectrum. Marvin Liao is an investor, executive coach, and formal advisor to several large family offices. One of his roles, he's previously been a partner at venture capital fund 500 Startups, the world revered organization, running the San Francisco-based accelerator program, as well as investing in seed startups. He's invested in over 400 pre-seed and seed stage startups over the last 6 years while he was there, the 6 years he was there. As well as that, Marvin has spent over a decade as an executive with lots of international and global experience in Asia, Europe, Latin America, as well as the States at Yahoo. So he's clearly got quite a lot of competencies inside and outside of large enterprise, as well as the startup environment. More recently, Marvin's been serving on the boards and as an advisor to several internet advertising and ad technology companies right across the world. Plus, I can also personally endorse his weekly mailer where he sums up his hot news articles that he's been reading, and I've certainly got a lot of value out of that. It's hardfork.substack.com. Marvin's weekly mailer, Hard Fork it's called. So the topic of today's presentation from Marvin is, we're going to explore investing in an applied AI in a pandemic world. So obviously those are there's a big theme here as well as AI. We've got a pandemic in our midst. So I'm very curious to see what Marvin's perspectives are on that. So I'll put myself on mute and welcome Marvin to the table.
All right, great. Thank you so much, Hubert. That's a nice, very, very nice intro. And so what I'm going to do is I have a deck, and so I'm going to share the screen and hope this works. And if not, then I'll just talk and hopefully it'll be interesting. All right, let's see. Is it working? Let's see. Keynote. All right, share. Please let this work. Is it working? Do you guys see something? Oh, it only works like 50% of the time. I do a lot of these like talks and they don't always work. Yeah. And so anyways, I'm going to jump into, so this presentation is roughly about 15, 18 minutes. I timed it last night. And so the topic is investing in AI startups in a pandemic world. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to probably give sort of at least a broad overview in general, sort of like what I'm seeing, and then sort of like very, very specific, because I think either for the investors out there or for startup founders who are just like, what exactly, like, how does a investor look at AI startups in this specific topic? So that's what I'm going to cover. All right. Okay. I don't know if I need to introduce myself anymore, but just, I've done a lot of deals, and AI, for obvious reasons, is an area that every investor is looking at. But one of the things that's been interesting is sort of this, during this last pandemic, particularly this last like 8-9 months, it's been a pretty interesting time. And so what happened basically in March, I can speak about the US, when the pandemic hit, because it didn't really hit the US until sort of like mid-March. Like I actually thought like this year would be like it was catastrophic on many fronts, right? I think from just like the economy front, I thought it would put a huge dent into the startup ecosystem. And there was a big slowdown in funding, at least what I saw here and with talking with a lot of my portfolio companies, investor friends. And so I thought there would be a huge dent. And so it did slow down a lot, like in March, April, May. But actually what has happened is we've seen what the pandemic has done is just completely reset the entire economy. And so what we found was that a lot of the trends that were already happening, so whether it's AI, digitalization, like rise of sort of like utilization of software, remote work, I go down the list, a lot of these trends that were actually happening already actually sped up. A lot of the trends that were actually happening, negative trends. So for example, offline stores, malls, a lot of these things actually like also sped up, right? And so the pandemic has actually pushed forward a lot of things that we are forecasting like 5 to 7 to 8 years from now, has actually pushed it up much further. And I think from a fundraising side, at least from pre-seed and seed side, and to some extent Series A, so these are typically 5 to 10 million when I talk about Series A, a little bit more big companies, starting in like June, July, what I saw happen was actually a lot of investors had raised a lot of money from their funds, earlier this year, end of last year. They still have to spend it. And so what happened is actually there was a huge dump of it's almost like this amount of money that was held back for 3 or 4 months. There was this huge wave of actually deep interest in investing in companies in general. And so it's actually come back. I can only speak about really the US market, but in the last sort of like couple months, it's the seed market, the pre-seed seed market, Series A market has become very, very heated. So the good news for founders working on interesting businesses, the money's coming back, right? The slowdown that I thought was going to happen actually didn't really happen. So it's become very, very hot again. And so right now it's actually a great time to be fundraising, which is, I was found very, very surprising. I think among a lot of my investor friends as well too, it was very, very surprising, but they're busy. So why AI? I talked about these sort of like trends, right? Like trends of AI was already forecasted to sort of like happen, and actually accelerate. And I think that the pandemic has actually forced a lot of companies to really start investing into digitization. And so that itself has actually been a very, very good thing overall for the AI industry. So a lot of the trends that have actually happened, a lot of the interest in AI has only sped up even more, not just from investors, but from large companies. There's been tremendous interest here. And it's was projected to be very, very large before, continues to be actually has sped up. And so some of the things that we look for ultimately is one of the first things I look for, just I look at in any company, any startup, but particularly in AI, just like, what is the problem that you're actually trying to solve right now, right? Because I use the term applied AI, and the other thing that I care about is like, why now, right? Like, and the why now questions, the timing really, really is important, because I want to understand sort of like what is happening on the consumer, on the B2B side, if you're selling to enterprise, like what's going on there, and what makes it sort of like, and what other trends are actually happening, and that around the same time that are actually sort of like an enhancement to sort of like what your AI, sort of like project or company is doing. The other thing that's also important is to understand is sort of like in the industry that you're going after, sort of like, why is the industry adopting this technology? There are certain industries, for example, like large corporations, typically sort of like, manufacturing starting to, use a lot of like AI right now. But like one of the industries that are not seeing a lot of adoption, surprisingly, is on the construction side, right? So for example, like a lot of it's also dependent on, sort of like what does adoption actually look like, and sort of the applications of it, of just like, do they make sense for where the industry is at right now? So timing. What I mentioned earlier is like market applications, right? So for example, financial services has been a very, very early adopter of AI. Education has not been. That's slowly changing. Government has not really been. That's slowly changing. Healthcare was not. There was a lot of talk about this in the earlier days of sort of like of how important AI sort of applications could be. And I would say the pandemic has definitely driven a lot of AI adoption in healthcare these days. Manufacturing also is very similar. And so, what the point I'm trying to make here is just like, I care a lot about not only do you have the technology, but like sort of, what is the application, the specific application, and which industries are actually looking to use this, right? What's the industry you're targeting? A big part, I saw this research study, there's a study earlier this year in Europe where it talked about like 40% of startups that talk about having AI actually don't have any AI at all, right? Or any machine learning. And I'm actually really, really surprised that number is so low. My experience is probably a lot of the startups I meet and talk with who say they have AI, probably only like 50% of them really do. And I would say maybe that number is probably even still probably too low. That most companies don't really have it. I look for, because AI expertise is very, very limited. Like there's not that many people have like real deep understanding. And so one of the things I look for, particularly in early stage companies, team has always been important in early stage companies. But one of the things, particularly in AI companies, of just like, you really need like to have deep expertise in this area. And one of the things that I notice is that, and I look at it of really the team's background, it's not always as important in early stage startups, but if you are an applied AI startup, you really do need to have this expertise. And a lot of this expertise is actually locked up by a lot of big companies. And so this is actually something I look at very, very carefully. So there was one company I invested in, and it was a AI machine learning company. But the thing that was interesting about it was that, the founders, like one guy actually led AI at Lyft, and another person actually started Azure and actually built a lot of the AI application for Azure. And so that was why that company was actually so compelling for us when I invested. We look at this sort of like, do you have the background in it? Could be academic, could be sort of like business background, but like, have you had experience actually building and actually utilizing AI? And not someone who's straight up, these are things that I think most investors look at. One of the things we think about is the cold start, right? So this term called the cold start is like, what are your data sources? You can have the best application, you can have sort of an interesting team, but if you don't actually have any real data sources and don't have access to sort of exclusive data, it's actually useless. And it's very, very hard, because if you think about the algorithms you're building, they're reliant on the data to sort of like process the data and to get smarter based on the data. And so that's, one of the things that of why, if you think about why most AI companies, the most important AI companies right now are the FANGs, right? Like Facebook, Alibaba, Amazon, Google, Netflix, because they have so much access to data. And so that's one of the challenges as a startup of just like, do you have access to data, and can you get access to data? Other part is really the data quality and exclusivity. How are you managing it, right? Garbage in, garbage out, of just like, if you do not have if you have access to data, but it's like not clean, that's something I want to understand as well too. We don't like to see black boxes of just like, hey, we have this like magic algorithm that does this. We actually want to understand how the data flows into your algorithm. We want how the different data sources interact and what happens, right? Like versus sort of like what we call black boxes of just like, we want to understand your architecture, and we want to understand what the data flows in to sort of see if there's actually something there. And this is actually something that when I talk to a lot of startup founders, like they're either unwilling to share, which is not a good idea. You should share it, right? Because how else are we going to assess it? Because otherwise, if you don't share, I think that you're just hiding something, or I think that you don't have anything as an investor. I want to understand your competitive landscape, right? I talk about this a lot. In most cases, you're going to have a lot of competition. So I don't just want to understand what the competition is. I want to understand how you're different and better, right? And it could be better algorithm, could be better data sources. Maybe it's just like, hopefully it's all of the above, right? Or maybe it's just like the way that the industry that you're going after, and the different way that you're doing stuff, the significantly different and better way that you're doing stuff. And typically we like to see that you're able to drive like just really, really good results, right? Like not like 10 times cheaper. Like we want to see at least like maybe 10 times cheaper, 10 times better results, whatever it is. We want to understand why you're significantly better than the competition. I want to understand your business model and your go-to-market, right? So it's just like, how are you going to make money from this? Is it a licensing model? Is it based on API calls? Is it going to be like straight sort of like SaaS? At the end of the day, it doesn't really matter. Like, just does it make sense? And so this is something I care a lot about. It's like, okay, assuming all the you tick the check, sort of like check the box for all the other parts before. If there's no business model, then it's just a science project, right? So ultimately, we're investing in businesses. I want to understand if you have users or customers, right? Are they like, do you have some proof of concept ones if it's very, very early? Like this is actually the ultimate test of actually whether you have something that will eventually be big or useful. And I'm going to leave sort of like one last tip, right? I think one of the benefits of being in a pandemic world now is just like the world is flat now. And so even if the company, like the edge that a startup founder used to have being based in Silicon Valley, is kind of gone now because you're not able to meet them, right? Or if you do it, it's like usually there's just some awkwardness right now, especially in the US, which is a disaster when it comes to sort of pandemic management. And so there's a lot of hesitancy in actually just meeting. And so that advantage that a founder being based in Silicon Valley has is overall like 80 to 90% kind of disappeared now. And so the world is flat. And so being a founder from anywhere, of just like I have a lot of portfolio companies based here in San Francisco. I'm still doing Zoom calls with them. And so even when I'm talking to new founders, I'm doing Zoom calls with them. So your geography actually doesn't matter as much anymore. Having said that, you still got to learn to present well. And having said that, you have to learn how to present well on Zoom, which I do think is it's a skill, right? Like you got to put in a lot more energy. You got to be much more organized and structured in a presentation on video calls. And so that's definitely something I'd say is just like, make sure you practice to, practice and learn how to do Zoom calls well. All right. And so, I'm going to leave this last quote, right? And so, which is why I think we're all excited about AI, why investors were all excited about AI. Andrew Ng, right? He's a very, very good investor. He started Coursera. He probably is one of the top experts in AI right now. So this final quote is that it's difficult to think of a major industry that AI will not transform. Right? This includes healthcare, education, transportation, retail, communications, and agriculture. There are surprising clear paths for AI to make a big difference in all of these industries. And I think, for all of us who've been in this industry for a long time, I think we all agree with this. And so it's really, pandemic or not, AI was going to be big already, but definitely from a pandemic perspective. And for all of us, like we should be very, very excited because I think the future is very, very bright for AI. And I think you're seeing a lot of industries that weren't adopting it before are adopting it very, very quickly now. So I think that's my presentation, Hubert. Thank you very much. And I hope this was interesting. I stopped sharing.
Excellent, Marvin. I just wondered, when did Andrew make those remarks?
I think it was like a couple of years ago.
Yeah, I thought so because he's been a voice in this area for a while, but obviously I dare say AI is becoming more and more the zeitgeist, not least alongside Zoom for the reasons you've pointed out. And as we go forward, I think that we may even expect more fresh voices and more fresh takes on the role of Zoom, the role of AI as well. So I'm just always curious, what are the timestamps on the latest and greatest as things are happening so fast? I've got a couple of questions, if you don't mind, Marvin.
Yeah, let's do it.
Okay, let's see, where are we? And yeah, okay. So what are the KPIs you tend to look for in deep tech AI startups? I'll just read the three of them and you might be able to blend them. I suspect they overlap. What are the KPIs you're looking for in deep tech AI startups? What is the domain of AI where you see the most opportunities for investing? And and the third one is valuation bigger if you are AI seed startup than regular SaaS seed startup? So that's a good question.
Okay. All right, let me answer the first question, right? So first question is, what are the KPIs? I would say for this stage, I'm actually looking for sort of like users, like, may not even be paid users, but like, someone who's actually using the product, right? Like sort of like not you or your mom. And so I do care a lot about like, and the KPIs are really, really going to be dependent on your business model. So for example, like if it's an API focused sort of like platform, then I actually want to be looking at like API calls. If you're selling to enterprise, some POCs would be helpful, whether it's paid or not. Paid is better than not than unpaid. And so just like somebody that's actually using your technology, and sort of even better if there's some sort of like use cases that are like very, very clear use cases. And so those are typically a lot of it. The KPIs, a lot of it's going to really depend on the business model that you're trying to build out.
Okay, so it's like the 10,000 users kind of adage.
Yeah.
And by the way, if you want, you can switch off the background. We can't really see it.
Yeah, it's kind of weird. All right, is this better?
Yeah, it's better, although it looks a bit into the sun, but at least we can see it.
Is this better?
Perfect. Okay. That's good. Excellent. So the other question of the two was, What is the domain of AI you see the most opportunities to invest in at the moment? I mean, I won't put words in your mouth, but I think I know what you might say.
Yeah. Well, I mean, for me, I actually think it's on the healthcare as well as in the enterprise side of things, like large companies. They've started working, like banks have woken up to this a while ago, right? So that's why fintech has always been very interesting. But you're starting to see like a lot of big companies in general, like Fortune 500 companies, like, holy crap, like we really need to start using this now. So that has really only happened, like started happening last year. I think the pandemic woke a lot of the senior execs up to this. So it's definitely happening now. So I'm seeing that a lot.
Okay, very good. Excellent. Fintech in healthcare and many more besides coming along. And the third question we had so far was, is valuation bigger if you're a AI seed startup than, say, a regular SaaS seed startup?
I mean, it depends. Like this is why it's still more art. But I think one of the things that I should warn most folks is just like, almost every single startup now has more AI for this, and it's garbage, right? So as an investor, we're so inured to this now, and it makes us super skeptical. And so if you're truly, truly AI, then probably it's okay. But remember, just like every startup, like what pitch deck are you look at that doesn't have like, we're AI for this? And so there's massive skepticism. And I also think like this term AI, where I think you have to be very, very careful about this, of just like, somebody said this, right? Like AI is kind of what electricity was. And so, you don't talk about startups now. We're this electricity, whatever startup, like it makes no sense. So like we're AI for this. The way I think about AI at the end of the day, it's going to be in the background. And so, everything I said about AI is true, just like it requires deep expertise. But what's happening is just like there's starting to be a spread of expertise and knowledge now, and it's becoming less and less of an edge. It is an edge, but it's not an edge, partly because there's so much noise out there. And so I don't know if there's significantly higher valuation. And also, if like the question comes down to, are you really truly an AI company or not? Most startups are not AI companies. And if you think that investor's not going to figure it out, then you're fooling yourself, right?
Absolutely, absolutely. And I really liked what you said. There are two things there really you chimed, are that AI is kind of in danger of being overused for, as you say quite
Well, I would
rightly.
say it's not endangered. It already is
Yeah,
overused, right?
right. Yeah. And the other aspect was that it tends to run in the background. Perhaps it should run in the background less than in the foreground, as we've seen in that overuse case. Yeah, very, very good. Well, those were the main questions. I mean, let's kind of, I mean, we've seen an awful lot of change this year. We've seen a lot more innovation. Mark Minovich was on earlier, and he gave a very impassioned call to arms, really, how we need to be better humans, we need to be a better society, and how we need to just make our decisions better. And one of the things I think you'd agree with, he was saying we don't need, well, we need to turn suggestions now into executions. And for the startup community, I think he was calling to arms, and indeed calling to arms to everybody, that we all need to play a role in seizing the day with AI and other it's time to get busy. It's time to drop the suggestions wish lists and turn it all into execution lists. Yeah, and I think that AI is perhaps one of the strongest avenues to do that, according to him.
Yeah, I mean, what's been interesting, if you take a look at like the innovation that's happening, and just like it is becoming easier to implement, and a lot of the big companies like Google, Facebook, and Microsoft, like they're all building platforms you can plug into now, and so it's becoming easier. Just like kind of software, if you think about how complicated software was, or even websites, right? If you think about like how hard building a website was like 20 years ago, you spent like hundreds of thousands, not even millions of dollars building a website, or
Yeah.
like, and now you have things like Wix or Squarespace or whatever. That's like it's like $10, and like just like you see sort of like commoditization of this technology over time, and I would say ease of use of this technology over time. And so these are all good things, and I expect the same thing will happen with AI over the next like 10 years too. It will become easier to use, and a lot of the difficult parts will become extracted, right? And you're just like plugging into this stuff. So over time it will become easier, but for now, I still think we're a little ways away from that.
Yeah, and how would I mean, to throw in the crypto remark, how or where would blockchain or crypto fit
I'm
into
not
anything?
sure. I'm not sure at this point in time, right? I think blockchain it's still early days in blockchain. So, you've used the internet sort of like analogy, like we're probably like in blockchain, like in 96, 97, it's still really, really early days. And I don't
Yeah,
see mass adoption for a while yet.
correct. Yeah. And then final question today, Marvin, is how would the same rules apply for a hardware AI startup in the sense it seems more time consuming to make an MVP in this industry? And I'm told here it relates to the first
Yeah,
question.
yeah, definitely, right? Like, anytime you add hardware to it, where it's an advantage and a disadvantage, just like everything. So, like scaling up like a hardware focused startup in general is hard. But on there is something to be said about like something like a fully integrated solution with hardware can be attractive once you can figure out the scaling stuff. So
Yeah.
yeah, I mean, just like it's hardware in general is hard, but companies have figured out like the world's most so the way I think about this is people bag on hardware, but bear in mind the world's most valuable company in the world is a hardware company, right? It's Apple.
Right. Yeah, very true for that. Good point. Well, I think we'll wrap it there.